Good morning. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us a little bit early today for Spy Chat. We have a great guest who has some time constraints. So we scheduled early, and I'm going to make my intro way too short. First of all, we have Chris Costa, my terrific executive director at the museum. He's going to be leading the conversation, and he's joined by Ambassador Robert C. O'Brien, who recently served as the 28th United States National Security Advisor from September 18th, 2019 to January 20, 2021. Chris and the ambassador will be making some initial comments, and then we'll turn to your questions later in the program. Now, before I turn this over to Chris and to Robert, I want to share a very special thanks to our sponsor, the Honorable Mary Beth Long, who serves on the International Spy Museum Board of Directors. And she is such a supporter of the museum, and her continued commitment to the museum and Spy Chat is incredibly appreciated. So over to you, Colonel Costa.
Hey, Amanda, thanks as always for the great introduction. I'm really happy to have my friend uh, Robert O'Brien, Ambassador O'Brien, I should say, and I'm excited to have this program and take your questions. For the sake of time, I'm going to move very quickly through some of the headlines that I am tracking. First and foremost is that of an intelligence failure. The headline was, did Mossad and the Israeli Defense Forces suffer from a intelligence failure in the lead up to the recent Gaza war between Hamas and Israel. So the basis for that article in the Jerusalem Post suggested that Mossad director, who I've met, and he's a very capable director by the name of Yossi Cohen, he's been facilitating funding from the state of Qatar to go into Gaza, really to ensure that there isn't an implosion. Hamas needed funds, the people needed funds. And of course, the United States considers Hamas a terrorist organization, and so doesn't Israel. So it's a sticky situation. Some have suggested that by providing that funding, what Cohen did as head of the Mossad, executing an Israeli policy, really uh, contributed to the recent conflict. That's an open question. Also, the fact that there was communal violence, was that underestimated by Israel? Did Israel expect the scope and scale of Hamas rockets? So a lot of things are being looked at in Israel. And of course, it's always a question, did the intelligence services somehow fail? Were there missteps? Were there miscalculations? So we can entertain some questions on that. Of course, I think most people are tracking that President Biden recently said, and of course, I'm transitioning here to coronavirus, from Israel to the coronavirus, right? We're going to talk a little bit about the fact that President Biden has said that the intelligence community in the United States needs to redouble its focus on understanding the origins of the coronavirus. We've heard that question before. It seems that President Biden is mildly rebuking the intelligence community and saying, hey, go back to the table, come back in less than 90 days now and give me an estimate on what the origin of that virus is. Frankly, China's been very opaque. I'm not sure we'll ever know the true origins, whether it came from a lab or animal to human transmission in some kind of animal market. I'm not sure we're going to find a smoking gun. The third article that I'm tracking very closely, of course, is Afghanistan. In particular, there was an excellent piece in the New York Times, very, very detailed, and it was titled Spy Agencies Seek New Afghan Allies as U.S. Withdraws. And the theme, again, with great detail, talked about the West looking for excellent allies to provide intelligence in the aftermath of Western coalition leaving Afghanistan. In other words, is somebody going to be in place to provide intelligence on Al Qaeda, on ISIS? This is an open question, but the article also really went into a bit of a deep dive on the possibility of a second resistance. They talked about the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud. And of course, Massoud was a famous tribal warlord who was killed on the eve of 9/11 because he was very much focused on going after Al Qaeda circa 2001 and before. So the question is, are Western intelligence services going to have a relationship with the son of Massoud? And the consensus is uh, the West is going to need to have intelligence partners, but certainly what we don't need is a proxy war. So, open question again, what's going to happen insofar as building a intelligence network after Western forces have departed from Afghanistan? And the other story I want to talk about from a counterintelligence front, this is fascinating. The German intelligence service, the domestic intelligence service of Germany called the BFV, uh, the Office of the Protection of the Constitution. We've talked about this in the past year. They have been given an additional mandate and have literally stood up a department to look at conspiracy theories and focus on coronavirus deniers, as some of these deniers are going to turn from protesters and people who believe in these conspiracies to violent actors. So the Germany has taken steps to literally stand up a department to look at that particular problem. And a couple other articles that I'm tracking very closely. One takes us to France, two pieces to this article. It's titled France's Macron Eyes Artificial Intelligence to Monitor Terrorism. We shouldn't be surprised in this program that artificial intelligence is looking for algorithms to track people that are online and perhaps web browsing in sites that terror suspects might go to. That shouldn't be a surprise. But what was interesting in this same article, it suggested, actually, it referenced that retired French generals have written an open letter that said that France is sliding toward an open war, a civil war specifically, focused on the problem of Islamic, not Islamic, Islamist separatists. So that's really an important story when you step back and think that retired generals in France are significantly concerned about this problem of Islamist separatism, and they openly challenged Macron in a letter. Several of those officers are on active duty. So it's an interesting story. We should track it. It was a very fascinating piece in the Wall Street Journal. Um, the last piece I want to talk to, a little bit out of order, is relative to Afghanistan. And again, we have talked repeatedly about hostages and hostage recoveries. And I want to remind our audience, our international audience, that we still have a Western hostage, a US citizen by the name of Mark Frerichs. And we're losing time, the United States is, to recover Frerichs and to put pressure on Pakistan and to ensure that Pakistan can use leverage with their relationships that they have with the Taliban. So that's the last story I wanted to flag. And just a shout out, I think we're going to be able to post an article that was just published this morning that I think is very well done by ABC's James Meek, talking about Mark Frerichs, talking about the challenges of bringing him home. His family certainly deserves that. And then the last thing I want to shout out, this book called The Good Assassin. I don't know if you guys can see it in this magic background. Maybe you can't, but you can find it in the Spy Museum store or online. The book is written about how the Mossad tracked down a Nazi in South America circa 1965. And it's a fascinating story of tradecraft and the viciousness of the Butcher of Latvia. Shukers was his name, the individual that they tracked down and subsequently assassinated. It's an excellent read. I also encourage you to check out the podcast. But before we turn to Robert and take questions from our guests, maybe we can hear from you, Robert, on your assessment of the summit. Um, it almost happened real time in the last couple of days. We watched it play out on TV. At least we saw a good deal of commentary. I really would like to know your take. You've been that person who sits in the room. You have that experience. And also, I very much would like to hear how that relates to wrongful detainees who, as far as I know, also came up at least on the side of the summit, or I certainly hope wrongful detainees did come up. Maybe you can talk about those being held by Russia. I think we've made some progress, but I'm not quite certain. And lastly, if you can share some of your perspectives from working so diligently on hostages. Over to you, Robert.
Chris, thank you very much. And for those of you watching who may not know Chris's background, he's really a great American who served this country in the Army and in the intelligence services and at the highest levels of the White House. He and I had the opportunity to work together early on in my tenure as a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. And so he's a great American. He's done terrific work for the American people across the spectrum of the military, the intelligence community, and also on the hostage recovery enterprise. So Chris, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me. If you haven't been to Washington and you're planning on going, there are two great spy museums in Washington. One is on the first floor of Langley at the CIA headquarters, and that's not open to the public, as you can imagine. The other one is the Spy Museum that Chris and Amanda are involved in and run. And if you get a chance to go to the Spy Museum, it's terrific. I don't want to. I've got a ton of respect for the curator and for the folks at Langley, and they've got a terrific museum. But I'll tell you this: there's only one spy museum in Washington, and that's the one in downtown. So go visit the Spy Museum if you get a chance. It's a terrific place. Mary Beth, who's an old friend, thank you for sponsoring the podcast today and the video. Your continued interest in American public policy and foreign policy and defense and intelligence is great. And so thank you for your sponsorship today. So it's a nice time for me. This is the about this time of year is my the kind of the top of the summer for me. It's a little bit like Christmas, and that's because Brad Thor, who's a close friend of mine, and many of you probably read Brad Thor's books. Brad Thor's book is coming out in July, I think on July 20th. It's called Black Ice. But because I'm a friend of Brad's and talk to him from time to time about his books, I get the advanced version. So since Chris gave a shout out to a book, I don't do product endorsements, but this is Brad's new book, Black Ice, that's coming out next month. I'm about a third of the way through it. When I was younger, I'd just stay up all night and power through the book. Now, as we've gotten a little older, I fall asleep and with the book on my chest. But it's a fast-paced read. You'll enjoy it. But what Brad does here, and I'm going to talk about it in the context of the summit, he always gets a little bit ahead of the headlines. And this book focuses on the Arctic and the great power competition that we're facing in the Arctic now, with China declaring itself to be a near Arctic power, which is a made up term that only the Chinese Communist Party can come up with these sorts of legal justifications for involvement in the Arctic. The closest Chinese territory is about 900 miles from the Arctic, so they're not a near Arctic nation, but they're claiming to be. And the new Arctic Passage, the Northwest Passage, where we're going to be able to cut down shipping times dramatically from Asia to Europe and to the United States through the Northwest Passage, which will be open longer and longer as we experience the effects of climate change. That's going to be a massive economic boom to many countries, Arctic countries, but also other countries in the world. The Chinese have relabeled that route the Polar Silk Road. So it's Brad's getting ahead of this. The Russians obviously have very expansive claims in the Arctic, and they are a legitimate Arctic power. They're part of the Arctic Council. They put a lot of their defense spending, their renewed defense buildup into the Arctic with a massive number of icebreakers, with refurbishing former Soviet bases in the Arctic Circle. And the Russians are very interested in the Arctic and believe that's their, it may ultimately become their primary area of operations for the Russian Navy and Russian military. So I know President Biden said yesterday that the Arctic came up in the summit. It's actually an area where we have some overlapping interest with the Russians. The Russians aren't interested in having the Chinese dominate the Arctic the way the Chinese have attempted to dominate the South China Sea or other regions of the world. The Russians have strong relations with the Chinese, but notwithstanding those, they're smart enough not to want the PLA Navy and China all over the Arctic. So That's an area of overlapping interest for us with the Russians, and it's an area where we may be able to work together. Specifically on the summit, in response to your question, Chris, they're very interesting events. I did several summits with where we met with Putin and Lavrov. Secretary Pompeo and I represented the United States at the Berlin summit last year and dealing with Libya. And then I held a summit last fall with General Patrushev, my counterpart, the National Security Advisor of Russia. The first one was in Berlin. The second one that I did was in Geneva. I can tell you there's no better host for a summit than the Swiss. Geneva is just designed for diplomacy. The Swiss are excellent hosts. They're excellent diplomats. As you saw yesterday, for those of you who watched the summit, it's laid out well. The security is terrific, and the atmosphere provided by the Swiss is really great. So I want to compliment, first of all, the Swiss hosts the summit. They did a terrific job. When it comes to the summits themselves, it would have been nice to see some deliverables, but the Russians are difficult. They're master negotiators. When they come to these summits, President Putin speaks very softly. They have a quiet confidence. They're really master negotiators. They look for any weakness or sign of weakness, and when they see it, they pounce on it. And so we don't know what happened behind closed doors. There was some controversy about the two presidents not taking questions next to each other. I actually complimented yesterday Jake Sullivan, my successor as National Security Advisor, and Secretary Blinken for having separate news conferences. I didn't think a joint news conference would have been the best situation. Vladimir Putin is an expert at those conferences. Annually, he holds a press conference that goes 3 or 4 hours. He takes all comers. He's a highly trained KGB propagandist and uses those venues to his advantage. I thought so. And our president, President Biden, and look, we wanted this summit to succeed. I'm a different political party, but when it comes to the water's edge and the president going overseas to meet with our near peer competitors and adversaries like the Russians or the Chinese, we want the best for our country, and we wanted the summit to succeed and be a success for America. I think the president, who was at the end of what for him was probably a grueling trip, his first long overseas trip, doing the press conference separate from Putin made sense. I thought the remarks that he delivered at the outset of his press conference on the teleprompter remarks were terrific, and so I don't have any criticism of the way that was set up. The Seoul press conference for Putin did give him a chance to spin Russian propaganda without being challenged. And so that was unfortunate. And Secretary Pompeo pointed that out yesterday. But I think overall the staging of the summit went well. The concerns I had, and I expressed this yesterday and some of the analysis on TV with the summit, is it looks like it turned out to be talks about talks. And there may have been nothing more we could have done about that, but usually you don't bring in the president of the United States to meet with a senior foreign leader, a head of state or head of government, without having some deliverables. Unfortunately, there were no deliverables yesterday other than a commitment that the parties would continue to have discussions. And so that may not have been the best use of the president's time, that sort of summit. But on the other hand, we do need to have a relationship, and we need to talk to the Russians, notwithstanding their malign activities, whether it be in Georgia or Ukraine or Moldova or Syria or Libya or in the cyberspace. So I'm glad we're talking to the Russians. Eventually, we need to pull the Russians away from the Chinese, and so that it makes sense to have those conversations. But it's a little unfortunate that the diplomats on both sides weren't able to prepare some deliverables that would have been good for the U.S. national interest as a result of allowing that summit to take place. One of the things I mentioned yesterday is that one of those deliverables could have been the return of Trevor Reed and Paul Whelan from Russia. I was hoping to see that perhaps they'd come down the plane stairs with Vladimir Putin, and that he would have brought them back and delivered them to President Biden as a sign of good faith at the outset of the negotiations. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I don't blame the current folks, our SPIHA, Roger Carstens, or National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. I know they're 100% committed to bringing our hostages home. And those Russian cases are tough cases. I raised them in Geneva with Patrushev. I thought we were very close at one point to obtaining their release. And but these are they're complicated situations. But it would have been nice if we could have somehow arranged for the summit to have included their homecoming to their families. With that, I'll turn to the Afghanistan issue, and then Chris, go back to you and Amanda and open for questions or questions from the audience. Mark's case is a tough case. That's another one that we worked on very hard. And I want to compliment Zal Khalilzad, our envoy for Afghan peace, our former UN envoy and former ambassador to Afghanistan and Iraq. Zal is an incredibly skilled diplomat. He and I worked closely together to bring other hostages home, including Kevin King and Weeks. So it's a good thing for the families that Zal is working on Mark's case. I know he's very committed to hostages. In fact, he lent a hand in working on some of the Iranian cases with us when I was both the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs and also the National Security Advisor. The fact is we're leaving Afghanistan. We've been there for 20 years. And with great power competition and near-peer adversaries like China and Russia, the U.S. just can't spend $3 billion a month on Afghanistan. And after 20 years, we've given the Afghans breathing space to rebuild their own military as a government and also to work out arrangements among themselves to have peace in their country. We've significantly degraded al-Qaeda. And since September 27th last year, when the peace agreement was signed with the Taliban, we have not had a combat death in Afghanistan. And that's a major, major accomplishment of President Trump, Secretary Pompeo, Zal, and others on the team. I can tell you the toughest thing to do as National Security Advisor, or certainly to be when you're President of the United States, is to go up to Dover for the dignified transfer of the remains of our fallen heroes. And in the early days of my tenure as National Security Advisor, I think I was up there half a dozen times, 3 representing the president and 3 with the president. And those are tough, tough days. And the fact that we haven't had to go to Dover to bring Americans home from Afghanistan since that peace deal was signed, I think is something the American people are grateful for. And it also allows us to strategically pivot to the challenge of our generation, which will be the great power competition with China in the Indo-Pacific. But having said that, we don't want to leave anyone behind. We don't want to leave Mark behind in Afghanistan. And I can tell you that in no way did Mark's case get pushed to the side because of the peace agreement. In fact, it was front and center in all of Zal's negotiations. So I know that's an issue that he's continuing to work, that Roger Carstens, our new SPHA, is working hard on. I know Jake Sullivan is seized of the issue and will hopefully bring Mark home soon. Chris pointed out that President Trump brought home many, many hostages. In fact, I think it was an unprecedented record by President Trump of bringing Americans home from all over the world, from Iran and Venezuela and Syria and Lebanon and Africa. And some of those we paid a heavy price. I know in one rescue mission, we had 2 French commandos who were killed rescuing an American, a South Korean, and 2 French tourists in the Sahel. They died in a gunfight, literally in the tent in which the hostages were being held, to secure their lives and save them from being executed as the raid unfolded. So there's a heavy cost to many of those efforts. And when I became the Special Presidential Envoy, I received a memo that described what the office did. And it said the use of military force is a last resort when it comes to rescuing hostages. And I changed that memo and changed that policy and said that we're going to look at our military option as the first resort. And if we can rescue our hostages, we're going to do so. And we did so with Mr. Walton late last year in Nigeria. We had a number of operations that I can't get into with respect to other hostages. Our allies, whether it was UAE or France, engaged in very dangerous operations to rescue American and other hostages. And if there was an opportunity for a military rescue in Afghanistan of Mark, I'm sure that would be looked at very carefully and perhaps even green-lighted, given some of our past success. But these are tough operations. It's tough to locate the hostage. It's tough to get eyes on. It's tough to put our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in harm's way unless we believe there's a real serious chance of recovering the hostage. And I know that even in a withdrawal situation, those options will be continued to be reviewed on a regular basis. And for our adversaries who think that if we're not in Jalalabad, or if we're not in Kandahar, or if we're not in Kabul, that we somehow don't have the ability to reach out and rescue our hostages, that's just not true. We can reach out at times and places of our choosing. We've got tremendous reach, and I won't go into the capabilities. Chris knows them and has lived those. But we have the capability to go anywhere in the world to rescue a hostage if we can get actionable intelligence. And so the captors of Mark Friedrich shouldn't take any solace from the fact that we're drawing down our troop presence in Afghanistan. We still will have the ability to get out and rescue him if that opportunity arises. One last thing on Mark's case, and that is Pakistan. Pakistan has partnered with us, but there sometimes other countries have their own national interests, and Pakistan certainly had different national interests in Afghanistan than the United States did. And they have significant influence with the captors, the network that has Mark. And I'd call on Prime Minister Imran Khan, who I think has done a really yeoman's work trying to revive the economy of Pakistan. He's very popular there. He's known to many of us as a star of the cricket world prior to becoming prime minister. The president met with him several times when I was in office, and I met with Prime Minister Khan, and I just appeal to him and to his generals and to their security services who are highly capable to do what you can to free Mark, because if you do, the gratitude of the United States will manifest itself, and certainly, although I'm out of office, I'll praise any such efforts that can be made by Prime Minister Khan or others in Pakistan to bring Mark home. It's something the American people would very much appreciate, not to mention his family and friends. And the last thing on hostages is, notwithstanding the success we had bringing folks home, and I think President Trump brought well over 50 hostages home from around the globe through a variety of measures, whether it was working with third parties, third countries to negotiate for us, whether it was negotiating directly with those countries, whether it was using economic sanctions or the threat of tariffs, whether it was military force, whether it was intelligence channels, and in some cases, prisoner swaps, where the prisoner that was being released here was nonviolent and was coming to the end of their term. Whatever tool we used, we were able to reunite Americans with their families. And those were great days, and it was a victory for the country and a victory for the hostage and for their families. But those weren't the days that I think of, and those weren't the hostages that I think of as I left office. I left in some sense, believing I'd failed the families of folks like Austin Tice and Siamak Namazi and Jeff Woodkey and Paul Overby and many, many others, the Citgo hostages in Venezuela, Paul and Trevor in Russia, and many others, some in Syria, some in Iran. And it's the hostages that didn't come home, that didn't get reunited with their family and friends, that you think of the most when you're done with this job. And I know Chris, who did terrific work bringing Americans home, probably feels the same way I do. So Mark is on our mind. He's in our thoughts and prayers. His family is as well, and we're hoping that he'll get home soon. So with those brief comments, Chris, let me turn things over to back to you and Amanda, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that I can. To the extent I can answer them, I'll do my best.
Thank you, Robert. Over to you, Amanda.
Great. Well, we have some very interesting questions from the audience already. One guest wants to know if there are any circumstances in which the U.S. would conduct cyber attacks on key Russian infrastructure.
So that's a good question. And that, the policy of the United States is not to engage in offensive cyber operations unless it's necessary to deter threats, imminent threats against the United States. And but I can tell you, and President Biden said this yesterday, we said this quite often, the United States has extensive capabilities, and I think the president referred to them as significant capabilities when it comes to cyber. I'll confirm that. Look, all international relations and national security policy in my view, comes down to a very simple phrase that Ronald Reagan made popular, but it goes back to Roman times, and that's called peace through strength. And by being strong and by having capabilities that our adversaries understand we can deploy if necessary to defend our country, that strength should deter our adversaries from undertaking operations against America. And that is true in the kinetic space, it's true in the diplomatic space, but it's all in the economic space, but it's also true in cyberspace. And so our adversaries need to understand that the US does have tremendous capabilities. And we're the country of Facebook and Google and the FANGs. And, we have, I think the world's become aware sometimes, not because we wanted them to, of the extensive abilities and capabilities that we have. I think our adversaries need to take that into account as they consider how they're going to operate in the cyberspace against this country going forward. Because I think the American people are no longer interested in these ransomware attacks. They certainly aren't going to be interested in any attacks against critical infrastructure. And I think the U.S. will respond to those attacks using the variety of tools in the president's toolkit. One of which will be cyber operations if those are necessary.
And I should have said, I jumped right into that question, but I was excited because we don't usually have a shout out to cricket during Spy Chat. So I totally appreciated that. And I also wanted to mention that we have had Brad Thor as a guest in a roundtable virtual program before, and he is a really awesome writer and speaker. So we approve of your endorsement of his upcoming book, and it's great beach reading. Okay, back to work, Amanda. One of our guests writes that this month, the situation in Tigray has been declared by the United Nations as a humanitarian crisis that is also a security issue. And they wonder, what will it take to really get this situation on the agenda for attention and concern?
No, unfortunately, this is kind of a typical story for Africa, which is a great continent. I've been there many, many times. I've traveled throughout Africa. I've been up to the Horn and into East Africa, and they're great people. There's no hospitality that you'll have anywhere in the world like you receive from Africans. It's a young population. It's the fastest growing population in the world. Africa sits astride tremendous natural resources. There's great promise there, and I'm hopeful that a bit of this African Renaissance that we've seen over the past decade will continue, and that there'll be a bright future for Africa. Unfortunately, up in the Horn, we've got a number of very fragile countries and some longstanding ethnic problems that are one which is unique to Ethiopia and up in the Tigray region. Many civilians are being killed. This is an area for the UN to get involved. I think the US needs to make it more of a priority. We've got a number of issues there. We have the Great Renaissance Dam project in Ethiopia, which is threatening the Nile and creating instability with South Sudan, and Egypt. So the Ethiopian government is on kind of the wrong side of that issue with many of our friends and allies in Africa, and yet, look, we want to maintain good relations with the Ethiopian government. Abe received the Nobel Prize. There was a lot of hope and promise when he came to power. So I think we need some intensive diplomacy to save lives and save Tigray lives. I think we need some intensive diplomacy in the whole region to bring about more stability. We obviously have Al-Shabaab operating in Somalia next door. One of the success stories of that whole region is a little country called Somaliland, which was a British colony and has declared its independence and has all the indicia of statehood, including having been very separate from Somalia. They united with Somalia when both countries, Somaliland and Somalia, received their independence, and realized that wasn't a great deal after a couple of years, and declared their own independence. But Somaliland is a big success story in the Horn of Africa that we can probably spend more time on. They've just engaged in some diplomatic relations or trade relations with Taiwan, and so there are some success stories in the area, in the region, and it's going to take a lot of intensive diplomacy. but it's a place we should be. The Chinese are very active throughout Africa, including up in the Horn. They've built a massive military base next door in Djibouti that is next to a French and a U.S. base. We've got to keep our eye on that, and they've built a citadel there. It's quite a base in operation. So as far as great power competition goes, as far as the future with a lot of young people who are going to be powering the world economy for years and years to come, and as part of just doing the right thing when we have these situations where innocent civilians are being killed in civil wars or tribal disputes. It's imperative that the U.S. is involved in Africa, and I'd encourage the new administration. I think they will, exercise diplomacy there, but also, be somewhat muscular with U.S. AFRICOM and our ability to maybe to shape the battlefield a bit in some of these areas. So, real concern, and again, we're praying for the folks that are, especially the civilians who are being harmed because of this I don't know if it's a civil war yet, but because of the this conflict, it's really taken a heavy toll on the civilians, and we need to do everything we can to help them and ameliorate the problem for the innocents.
Robert is leaving us a little bit early. Chris and I are going to stick around, Chris, to answer questions. But Robert, before you disappear, do you want to make some comments about where you're going and the 50th anniversary of the reversion of Okinawa to Japan?
Great. Well, thank you, Amanda. So I'm heading off in just a few moments to drive down to the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California. It's another great venue. So if you're out in California, a lot of folks go to the Reagan Library up in Simi Valley, which is one of my favorite presidential libraries. But the Richard Nixon Library and birthplace in Yorba Linda is also a terrific place to go learn about American history. And 50 years ago this month, Okinawa was returned to the Japanese. We had occupied and administered Okinawa since the end of the Second World War. It's an incredibly strategic island in the Western Pacific. The Japanese have ran Okinawa for the last 50 years. Many Americans who've been in the service, especially in the Marine Corps, have served time in Okinawa. It gives us strategic reach into the entire Western Pacific, and from there, our Marines can respond to contingencies across the Indo-Pacific theater. So, very important base for us, and what it did, that reversion did two important things, and it was highly criticized at the time when President Nixon decided to give Okinawa back to Japan. He was criticized for it, and folks didn't think we should give up such a strategic venue for our forces. But I think President Nixon, as he's reevaluated, many years after his death and after his time in office, which was marred by Watergate, I think his foreign policy looks very prescient on a number of fronts, including Okinawa. Think of what would have happened if Okinawa did not revert. The incredible relationship and alliance that we have with Japan, which I would argue with the rise of China is the most important, or arguably the most important alliance the United States has in the world at this time, would have been marred. The Japanese people would have never been happy with continued U.S. administration. It would have been likened to imperialism or colonialism. And so we took that thorn or that burr out from under the saddle of the relationship with Japan, and it led to a relationship now that is tremendous. We saw that the first foreign visitor to the White House after President Biden took office was Prime Minister Suga. That follows on Prime Minister Abe being the first person to visit President Trump, the first foreign leader to visit President Trump when they golfed together down at Mar-a-Lago at the beginning of his term. So we now have this tremendous relationship with Japan that would have been impacted had President Nixon not taken the heat and made the tough decision on the reversion. But the second thing is even more interesting. Right now, there are some claims in China that the Ryukyu Islands and Okinawa is the largest island in that chain, which are all administered by Japan and have been Japanese for many hundreds of years and are part of Japan. There are some in China claiming that those are actually Chinese territories, and they base it on the fact that in the 1500s, the small Ryukyu kingdom paid tribute to Beijing. And so much like the South China Sea or the East China Sea or Tibet or the parts of the Himalayas on the border with India, the Chinese have taken a very expansive view of territory. Now imagine if the US continued to occupy those islands and China made it a China-US issue as opposed to a China-Japan issue. No one questions and no one takes seriously claims that Okinawa is not part of Japan. But if it was a US administered territory, those claims might have further resonance. Moreover, they could also even be a flashpoint for a potential crisis between the US and China. So again, looking back for both those reasons, President Nixon's decision to revert Okinawa to Japanese administration and return that territory to Japan was a great move at the time. It shows how leaders sometimes have to make unpopular decisions and take the temporary heat for the long-term benefit of the country. So I'm going to head down to the Nixon Library. Ambassador Tomita is coming out from Washington to celebrate the reversion. I'm going to be there to applaud President Nixon's move back in the day. So thank you for asking about that. It's just been terrific to be here with Chris, who's was such a valued colleague of mine when he was in the White House and did so many great things for our country. To be here with you, Amanda, you and your team have done just great work with turning the Spy Museum into truly, I think, the best attraction in Washington. It's the first place I tell folks to visit when they come to town. Maybe I should say Lincoln and Washington Memorial first, and then head over to the Spy Museum. But thank you for what you're doing to celebrate the quiet professionals, the men and women in our intelligence service, who risk their lives and give up so much to keep us safe. And the Spy Museum is really, I know both of you feel this way, as a tribute to those professionals, those men and women who serve in the IC. And so thanks for what you're doing. And thank you for having me today. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Hey, thanks, Robert. Thanks for your kind words and informing the public on national security issues. And it was a privilege to work with you. And I really appreciate you joining Spy Chat today. Now, our audience, if they stay on, will have to suffer through me answering questions for the next 15 minutes. So thanks a lot. I know you've got to run. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Chris. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Amanda. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Robert.
All right, Amanda.
All right.
Next.
All right, Chris, you don't get off that easily just because he disappeared. We have some interesting questions that have come in, and one of the things is a sense of election results denial as being a trend. We're seeing, I guess that's happening in Peru right now as well, and then in our local and national press talking about the President Trump's maintaining that the election was false, is keeping people who are involved in the January 6th, incursion on the Capitol, are staying in, are in hot water because now they're looked at as being, people who are going to continue on with that. So I don't know if you have any comments about election denying.
Well, I think it goes back to the story today. I mean, it's a much broader issue, and I think this question is really important. So I'm happy to engage on it. But what the Germans have realized of late is that there is a nexus between some actors that are roiled and animated by conspiracies, and they're moving from their own personal point of view and the freedoms that they have within German law, and then they're moving into a very dangerous place where they might mobilize for political violence. And it's not just a United States phenomenon. So I appreciate you pointing out, where did you just say, in South America as well, right?
Peru, yeah.
And what it does, it also it stirs the pot with issues that weren't resolved historically in those countries. I mean, what caught my interest in Peru in particular is the Shining Path, a now essentially defunct Maoist terrorist organization. But all of a sudden, some Maoists start showing up in places in Peru, animated to counter elections that they deem are problematic. I'm not sure how much the elections have played into that, but you can just understand the logic of online inaccuracies that turn into a reason to commit violence. And the United States, the FBI in particular, have recently warned. I looked at it only briefly this morning, an unclassified report that was published, available to everyone that's listening in today. And the warning suggested that people in QAnon, some people, are going to move into the realm of political violence, and they're animated by conspiracies. And as I said, even Germany has stood up a whole department within their domestic intelligence service just to look at those dynamics. So it is a problem. It is something that's not going to go away. And it's become a strategy. And the last point I'll make, recently in Israel, the Shin Bet, the head of the Internal Intelligence Service, suggested that comments made by both sides during the Israeli back and forth about the new government could also animate political violence in Israel. Almost unprecedented, the way we're couching it in Israel, among Israelis. So it's a fascinating dynamic. We need to watch it very, very closely.
So Robert was talking about the Polar Silk Road and the Arctic as a sort of territorial battleground. What about the moon?
Well, I think space is going to be an area that will continue to be exploited in some cases, and certainly explored. We want to see exploration versus exploitation, but the bottom line is there's plenty to go around, right? And the United States and Russia in the past have competed for that space. China, no pun intended, and China certainly is very interested in competing in space exploration. I'm not an expert on it, but I think that's why the past administration stood up a separate command to really focus on space, right? Some people have derided it. I have no opinion on that. But at the end of the day, it's important. It is another domain, just like undersea. But as Robert talked about with great detail, the Arctic is a province that we're going to have to compete in. We, being the United States, and other nations in the world, are going to want to compete in that space for a variety of reasons. One of those being natural resources, and Russia will consider that part of their sphere of influence. So these are really, really important dynamics. I will also parenthetically say I participated in some scenarios where, the great power competition that we talk about frequently here will play out in the Arctic space. So excellent question. I wish I had more background on it. Thank you.
Tied in, you knew it was coming, Chris. UAPs, UFOs, how concerning is this? There was a really interesting piece in the Washington Post that we shouldn't be broadcasting where we are because we don't want the aliens to find us. So any thoughts that you have?
Just that there is a serious national security concern, and the concern is our aircraft have been buzzed, if you will. I'll use the aviator term, by phenomenon that we don't know its origins. So that in and unto itself is problematic. So we really have to reconcile, our national interests with the science and try to determine what the phenomenon is. And the first step is, I think, some public discourse and sharing. And I think that's the path we're going down with what the United States knows and what it doesn't knows. No, we don't want to share what our capabilities are in terms of a comparison and a contrast. We don't want to reveal our secrets in this discourse, but I think it's really important to understand this is a serious issue, particularly when this phenomenon takes place in restricted airspace, near military bases, near aircraft carriers that are deployed. So I am very interested in this, and only recently have I started reading more in depth. I belong to private networks of people that share information and have far more depth in this, but they've gotten my attention with how serious this is. Our very own H. Keith Melton, who has given us many of our wonderful artifacts, will be doing a forthcoming program on this aerial phenomenon. So stay tuned for that. I, I think it's separate from the Spy Museum, but still, we'll make sure we get the word out. Thanks for the question.
And then one guest wants to know, how much do you feel that political opinion and agenda is influencing the interpretation of facts in intelligence? He believes that, many formerly apolitical agencies are now being heavily affected by the political opinions of their leaders. And how do we, if you agree or disagree with that, and how do we ensure that the interpretation of intelligence does not become politically polarized?
Thanks, Amanda. It's an important question. It's one I like to talk about briefly. So I'll push back a little bit on any assertion that intelligence is politicized in the United States in particular, because that's where I spent a good deal of my career working, but we've fought against politicization. That's not to say that politicians won't try to interfere in the political process, but all professionals in this business are trained, taught, it's inculcated in everything, everything you learn about the business of intelligence, that you can't be politicized. You have to push back against that. You have to be unafraid to speak truth to power. I can think of past DNIs who have fought those fights. That's not to say that intelligence isn't politicized. And hadn't really thought a lot about this of late, but because the question of the origins of the coronavirus is back on the agenda, one could argue that it's back on the agenda because when the past administration was asserting, in some cases very strenuously, not the intelligence community, but politicians were saying it's most definitely coming from a lab in Wuhan. It was dismissed because politicians were making these assertions. The intelligence community has quietly tried to acquire intelligence, work with the scientific community to deliver a product. And that product's going to be imperfect for a variety of reasons. But at the end of the day, the intelligence community was quietly committed to then and now to providing a deliverable to this president, President Biden now, that makes some judgment. Again, the fact that they're going back to the drawing board means, and looking at the lab, means maybe it was dismissed too early for political reasons by actors on both sides with the back and forth. So at the end of the day, there is politicization of intelligence by politicians on all sides of the spectrum. That said, I think the intelligence community holds steady. So that's how I would answer that question.
That was great. And I think I'm going to butcher this question, or else I'm going to streamline it. We'll find out. Really asking about conspiracies and if there are any examples of operations from history of using conspiracy in political operations. I can think of influence operations. I'm sure you can too, Chris, where conspiracy is at the base of it. I'm thinking about the AIDS
Right.
campaign.
Well,
Do you?
no, I agree with you, Amanda. You could be our next guest on Spy Chat. You know these issues as well as I do, because we talk about a lot of these issues here at the Spy Museum. And the classic example is the fact that the Russian intelligence services took a conspiracy theory that wasn't online, because this was before the internet was part of our everyday discourse, everyday life. But planted in a newspaper, I believe in India, was this idea that HIV left a lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland, or it was experimented with. HIV, of course, the virus that causes AIDS, was a US CIA or military experiment gone bad. And it was planted in a paper. That rumor was planted in a paper, a newspaper. It took in India, it took a long time to get some legs, but then the United States had to continually try to counter that narrative. In some cases recently, as late as last year at the eve of election, there were conspiracy theorists talking about the idea that these kinds of things are happening in African American African American neighborhoods here in the United States. Again, taking conspiracy theories and trying to sow disunity broadly. That is happening routinely by intelligence services using and exploiting the internet and social media, and as we've said in the past, weaponizing social media. So yes, so that's a great question. It continues to happen, and there was a historical precedent. We always like to talk about that particular example because it's so relevant today.
And so I thank the questioner, and I've already apologized to him in a private chat in case that wasn't the question he was asking. So, but Chris, people stayed with us even after the ambassador left. And so that tells me that we can have you be just the guest anytime we want. I want to thank everyone for joining us an hour early. So we put people through a lot of paces today and they made it. Chris, you were fantastic host and then guest, always doing a great job. And do you have any comments before I wrap it up?
Just a closing comment. We can't do this enough. And for those of us who come to Spy Museum programs, I want to thank our team. The museum's back open 7 days a week. I know how hard it was to pivot to online programs. Our guests have made Spy Chat really popular. We hope we're delivering something to the public worldwide, in a responsible way, talking about national security issues. We don't have all the answers, but certainly we want discourse that people aren't screaming at one another and that we're trying to unwind what's in the news. But it's our team that keeps the wheels on the car, and I really appreciate everybody joining. We'll see you next month. Same time, right? I'm sorry, different time. It'll be back to our normal time, which will be noon Eastern Standard Time. So pay attention to our future guests and please join us. Thanks again, Amanda and Spy Team. Thanks for everyone tuning in today.
And last but not least, definitely not least, thank you to Mary Beth Long for her continued support of the museum and Spy Chat. Check our website for any other programs. And if you'd like to keep attending and you feel like making a contribution, I have to ask you if you will find that link and donate to us. So thanks, everyone. We will see you soon online or in the museum.